starting off with like my day job, what I do, I run an intensive outpatient program that focuses on chemical dependency and trauma related disorders. So that's sort of my day
Okay.
to day. So a lot of addiction work. And as soon as I got into addiction work, I knew immediately that if I don't become competent treating trauma, I'm going to be
Mhm.
very bad at this job. I think especially at this level of care, right? Which is like one step below hospitalization. I don't know if there's what the equivalent would be outside of the United States, but it's pretty high level of care. It's 9 hours a week that I spend with people typically. And it's almost unanimous that if someone ends up in this level of care, that there is a very significant trauma history too. So I was like, okay, well, I got to figure out as much about this stuff as possible. And that sort of kicked off that journey. It's not where I expected to be or what I even wanted my specialization to be, but it's sort of where I ended up.
But that's the thing, they're also intertwined: trauma, addiction, mental health, essentially lessons that we've learned from our environment. So to some degree, you have to be trained in all three, four, five different aspects, however many there are, so that you can provide care to an individual, because everyone is different. We try and throw people into boxes and say, oh, you've got ADHD, so you've got this, or you've got bipolar, so you've got this. But we both know it's not really the case.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the conversation I have with people a lot, kind of like a chicken and the egg thing with
Yeah.
addiction, which is like, did I become, addicted because of all of these past experiences, or, did I start using drugs and accumulate all of this trauma, and that sort of kind of kept fueling it. And it's messy, right? People are messy. There's not like a sort of one size fits all approach. But what I think everybody agrees on is that these past experiences absolutely are kind of fueling the our trajectory, right, to a certain degree. The analogy I use with my patients when I'm working with them, it's kind of the difference when we're talking about substance use. That is, like, if you give someone who's experienced a bunch of trauma, a substance of some kind, it's like giving someone who's been walking through the desert, for 3 days with no water, a glass of water, versus someone who, has never, or someone who's like fully hydrated, right? So it just kind of grabs you, right? Because of those, it fills that need, I guess, that is sort of left in our brain.
Yeah, I was talking to someone else today. Funny enough, another bald guy from America. I feel like I've met my twins today in an interview. He was a correctional officer for a period and then also went inside, but struggled with addiction to alcohol. And we were discussing where that came from. Personally, my addictions at one point, I struggled with marijuana, and it was the ability to help me escape from reality and escape from the pain that I was feeling inside. I don't know if that's, I think you can relate to that, or you have some understanding of that with your patients, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And you bring up marijuana, and there's a frustration I have with people not taking like that addiction seriously, right? As we sort of, that's really what I see too. Every substance sort of has different challenges in terms of treatment, but one is my people who have cannabis use disorder have a really hard time. Like, they're basically pushed out of rooms, right, in the AA space, and it's really really frustrating. But you're right, like, Gabor Mate, I don't know if you're familiar with him. I think most
Very
people who are sort
familiar.
of, yeah, in that trauma space, he says, not why the addiction, why the pain, which I think is a really, succinct way to kind of put it, right? We're covering something up there in a good way to figure out some of your goals too, is like, what is this drug doing for you? And how can we get more of that in our life in a way that's not holding us back, right?
Super interesting. I mean, now I'm thinking about myself. Like I said, I used it as a way to escape and a way to, I don't know, hide from my unhappiness. But
Mhm.
in reality, what I needed to do was face my unhappiness and accept it and move through it. The biggest driver for me in quitting was to do the podcast, because it's really what I'm passionate about, because I don't want people to hurt like I hurt. And I listen a lot to Jordan Peterson. He talks about doing something meaningful with your life, not something necessarily fun or something that brings you happiness, but something that brings you fulfillment. And that was, I think, what was missing from my life, a sense of, what am I actually doing with my life? What am I actually achieving personally? I don't know about you. Have you ever struggled with addiction? We haven't talked about that.
So I have not struggled with addiction. My trajectory into the addiction space was, like I said, mostly accidental. So I did have a period. Well, I guess I'll just kind of like walk us through that trajectory, because substance use is involved in it a
The
little bit.
floor,
But
The floor is yours, man. You talk away.
Well, yeah, thank you. So I started. I had very early onset OCD, so I started showing symptoms around like 6, 7 years old. It was a scrupulosity at that point, right? Which is sort of a religious fixation. I was at a Catholic school at the time, so it wasn't hard
Oh, they're
to.
fun, aren't you? Aren't they? They do a number on your brain for a bit.
They did, and my OCD really latched onto that, right? So, constant rituals and praying, avoiding the color red, the number six, all kinds of fun stuff. It was a bit weird because, my parents, they were concerned. They thought it was like, schizophrenia because, when you're a kid and you're having intrusive thoughts, it feels like voices, right? Something outside of yourself. So that's kind of the way it presented. But they brought me to a child psychologist and they were like, he, overactive imagination is sort of what they came away with. I don't quite understand why it happened, but it sort of went away for quite a while. And when I was 16, it got really severe again, right? So if we were kind of measuring, on that scale, I was all the way on the other end of it, and that over 4 hours a day spent obsessing, washing my hands, 4 showers a day, all of that stuff. So I was totally debilitated by it. And it went that, I didn't end up getting, I didn't want any treatment for it, first of all, because I was like, what is talking to some dude, gonna do to get me to stop compulsively washing my hands or obsessing about this stuff? Luckily, I had parents that saw those symptoms and they had some leverage, right? I wanted to go to college and they were like, you aren't going to go to, or we're not going to help you go to college if you don't also seek out treatment concurrently with it. So reluctantly, I went and I got very lucky because I ended up with good therapists, which, there's a lot of bad ones out there. And OCD is particularly specific to treat. So therapists tend to be, it's very bad at treating it. And luckily, I found a clinic. That's all they did. And we did exposure therapy, right, for about 2 years. Because by that point, my OCD had shifted from a religious fixation to a sort of contamination OCD. So fears of, feeling dirty all the time, washing my hands, again, all of that stuff. So we did something really fun. I don't know how familiar you are with exposure and response prevention therapy, but
Get out of my head because I was just writing it down so I could ask you about it. Tell us.
yes, absolutely.
'Cause I'm not.
So you start by creating a hierarchy of your fears, right? Your obsessions and compulsions. You start with the least severe and work your way up to the most. All right. One thing about this, because I do like talking about it because in hindsight, it's very funny, but I don't want to freak people out who are thinking about exposure therapy because when I jumped to the end, I was doing some pretty extreme stuff. They will ease you into it. They're not going to overwhelm you right away and you will surprise yourself. But it started, right, touching my shoes, whatever. And even then at that time was very stressful. So you touch your shoes and eat without washing your hands, whatever. And we worked our way up. And I'll never forget like the last, two exposures. I still haven't figured this out. I was smart enough, so I was 18 or 19 around this time. And I was smart enough to know that they weren't giving me a vial of real blood, but they did a very good job because it was in this little medical vial. It smelled like blood. And that exposure was, rubbing on my hands, not washing my hands and eating. I still haven't figured out how they quite did that. And I have worked with other exposure therapists and stuff, and I haven't found their blood recipe. But it was funny because I was in college and I just, had roommates. And so I had this like jar of blood in the refrigerator and they didn't know me very well. So I'm just this fucking weird guy, like, eating,
Washing his hands with blood and then eating.
yeah. So I'm sure that was very bizarre. And I've always been like a pretty open person. So, I would talk a little bit about it, but it was bizarre. And then the very last one they had me do was throw some paper clips in a toilet at their, clinic, reach into the toilet and pull the paper clips out. And you're not allowed to wash your hands, mind you. So carrying those paper clips around with me, taking them out, like constantly, rubbing all over myself. And after that, they were like, okay, you're fixed. See you later. I was no longer afraid of germs. And I got tremendous relief from that, man. I know, like, sort of at the end of it, and I think with a lot of successful treatment, there's almost like a grief that happens because you're like, I'm so much more comfortable now. And I spent so many years just totally overwhelmed. Like morning, to the time I went to bed, my mind was on something unpleasant, right? All of that energy, it kind of like ruined that first relationship, all of those sort of like times that you're going through during this like pivotal time in my development was sort of colored with some of the OCD stuff. But yeah, no, so I got a ton of relief, which was fantastic. So to anyone out there who is sort of on the fence, it's worth the work to sort of put into that. But at that point,
That goes for all mental health healing, though, right? You've got to put in the effort and the work to make a difference to yourself. You can't just sit back and hope it will fix. You have to take the lead.
absolutely. Yeah, there's no easy way. There's no way around it, right? The only way is through it. One thing, have you ever seen The Shawshank Redemption?
Oh yeah, of course, great film,
Yeah.
obviously.
One of the best, right? And
Yeah.
his tunnel through all the sewage and everything to sort of get out of the end of prison. I kind of equate that to trauma and exposure work, right? With OCD, any type of therapy that works, even if it's not therapy, right? Even if we're trying to work on this stuff on our own, it's going to involve some type of exposure, right? You're going to have to get uncomfortable to a degree. If our brain's not uncomfortable, we're not adjusting to anything, right? And so we that's something that we have to do.